All set.
This is a joint meeting of the Policy and DEIJ Subcommittees of the Brookline School Committee, June 12th, 2023. Welcome. We have several items on the agenda. First are minutes. Who would like to move approval of the DEIJ 413 minutes? Andy, second. Stephen, your vote?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
Mariah?
Yes.
And I vote yes. David, your minutes.
I would like to move the minutes of the last policy meeting. So a second.
Second.
Valerie, your vote?
Yes.
Stephen?
Yeah.
And I also vote yes.
And can I maybe just have policy also accept the 413 joint meeting minutes? I know it's redundant, but
Sure.
Val, you took the DEIJ, just so I'll have a record of
Yep.
policy also. Sorry.
Okay, so the policy side for DEIJ on the
Exactly.
DEIJ policy on the 13th.
Exactly, that joint meeting on the April 13th.
Great. Who wants to move those minutes? Stephen, I'll second them. Stephen,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
and I vote yes.
Thank you.
Okay. I believe that wellness, David, is that correct? You're up first with wellness.
Why don't we go to one of your items first? I'm trying to get my computer situation straightened out.
Okay. We can start then with the menstrual products, which I think is going to be a fairly short conversation. My understanding is that since we passed at town meeting, the menstrual product access piece as integrated into the newer reproductive equity and gender inclusivity bylaw, that reincorporates the menstrual product access piece of that. My understanding from town council is that we never adopted that and created a policy under that. I think we have to adopt it formally at full school committee and then draft a policy. So I'm going to be looking at new business at our meeting on Thursday for a discussion of fully adopting the requirements of the town bylaw. Does that make sense to everybody?
Is there a reason that we couldn't recommend, rather than sticking on a new business, why couldn't we recommend as a, whatever we are, this combined subcommittee for the full school committee to adopt the menstrual products bylaw?
Yes,
Like-
we then still have to do a policy under, but yes, we.
Yes, but like that way we
Yeah.
at least are
Yep.
lurching ahead slowly but surely.
Sure.
So can I move
Do you want
that?
to make that motion? Sure. Second on that motion? Andy? So we are doing this, I guess we'll do DEIJ first. Stephen, your vote?
Sorry, this is to adopt which policy?
The menstrual products access portion of the reproductive equity policy that passed the bylaw.
And that bylaw passed town meeting?
Yeah, I mean, this part of it passed town meeting a couple town meetings ago, and we never adopted it sort of officially at school committee. We implemented parts of it, but not in a way that puts that requirement on PSB and then under which we could form
I'm
a
just
policy.
confused as to why it's necessary to adopt it.
I went to the
Definitely.
bathroom in the basement of the Schlentz gym this week and the machine takes quarters.
Yeah.
You cannot get products out of it. I already flagged it for Matt, but the point is that the reason we have to is so that we actually have some compliance. Full
So the
compliance.
reason we have to, according to town council is why we have to vote it separately as opposed to the rest of the town bylaw is that from his perspective, that piece puts requirements on PSB beyond the sort of general bylaw that is the rest of that. What it was the rest of that warrant article that's now the all-encompassing bylaw. So we need to adopt that that piece as a requirement for PSB, which
Okay,
was always
I-
anticipated, I think, and was just never formalized.
Susan has her hand up.
Susan?
Hello, everyone. I hope you had a great weekend. I was just curious, when I read the bylaw, it talked about feminine products being available in all public restrooms. And I guess one of the things that crossed my mind was that, you know, kindergarten bathrooms would be public restrooms. And so how does that bylaw then translate into our environment? And would the expectation then be that even in those bathrooms, we would be required to provide them? So it's just a thought. So maybe if you have a policy, we could define what public restrooms are for the
Yep,
purpose of the policy.
Yeah.
So that might be a good idea. Just a thought.
So we've talked about this over the years when we thought that it was applying to us. And also I've talked to the lead petitioner, who is a former school committee chair, whose recommendation, and I individually agree with it, is to begin with 5th grade bathrooms and up, that anybody who, or 4th grade, anybody who has a possibility of menstruating should have access to those products. And then of course the nurses can have access as well. I mean, that again is like for the policy piece, we can have that discussion of the policy piece, but I think this first vote is just on recommending to the full school committee that we adopt the obligations of the bylaw.
We want to finish our vote.
Sorry, the motion is to adopt the obligations of the bylaw.
To recommend to the school committee, full school committee, that's
Sorry.
PSB, adopt the obligations of the bylaw.
It's the text of the bylaw. I support making available menstrual products for anyone who's menstruating in PSB or maybe about to menstruate in PSB. Is the text, I just don't know the text of the bylaw. Is that available any place that I can see quickly? Is that shared before the meeting? I'm sorry if I didn't see it.
Yeah.
It was in the documents that we reviewed during town meeting because it was part, or no, maybe they didn't actually include that bit of the reproductive access bylaw. I think that part got omitted just because it wasn't changing.
Was that part just X'd out when we did the vote?
I think it was, yeah, just like that was only the new part that they included.
Yeah, so not, I can't pull it up quickly, Stephen, but essentially it just requires access in public bathrooms in town. So in libraries, like across town, in all town buildings, the products are required to be
I
supplied.
vote for this.
And it's
Okay.
already, just to be clear, it's already happening, like the town side adopted, it's just that PSB needs to adopt it separately.
I vote yes.
Okay.
This is just to, again, to recommend to full school committee, which we almost are, but not quite. Betsy, do we have a motion and a second on it? I just want to make sure for DEIJ side that we
I
have.
was the motion and Andy was the second. If I
Okay.
recall correctly.
All right, so Stephen, you vote yes.
Mhm.
Andy,
Yes.
Mariah,
Yes.
and I vote yes for DEIJ. David, do you want to go through for policy?
Yes, I will move that we make that recommendation to the full school committees or seconds.
Second,
Valerie, your vote?
yes.
Stephen?
Yes.
And I also vote yes.
Are you functioning, David?
Yes, all right, so why don't we discussion on the wellness policy, physical education section. I don't think there are any further updates to that at this time, so we're going to need to defer on that. Which then brings us to a discussion of inclusion in the life of the school. And we have a couple versions of potential policies to look at on this. There was one that was drafted by Lisa, and then there was another one that I put together earlier today. Because I was hoping that we would have something a little more that goes a bit beyond simply saying that we're going to follow the law. And so the version we're about to look at now, I think, does that. But again, it's a very early draft, and I look forward to soliciting your inputs. So I'm going to, could someone maybe share the screen with it so we can all see it?
I have it, so let me share it. One
Okay,
second.
thank you.
It's Betsy.
Is everyone seeing it now?
That's not the right one,
Oh,
right?
sorry.
Quick question, David. Did you already discuss the wellness policy?
We basically deferred on it because we don't have the corresponding staff people. And there haven't been any changes since the last policy meeting anyway, but if you had something that you wanted to
No, I
address.
just wanted to know what it was. I didn't see it, so I don't know what it's about.
Okay,
Betsy, if you can send it to me, that'd be great.
Thanks, Mariah, for the Brookline bylaws.
Sure. I sent you the page link too. Or the page number.
Got it.
Is everyone seeing now the inclusion in the life of the school policy?
Yes.
Okay.
so I know this was shared only earlier today. Do any of you have any particular questions regarding it? Additions, modifications, subtractions? Go ahead, Mariah.
So, the big thing that I think is maybe, as I interpret this unsaid, and is the big issue, the actual big issue, or I'd say the, not the actual big issue, the primary big issue, I think, is the question of extended days. And I don't see extended days discussed here. You do talk about third-party programs, but then the language about the PSB obligation to the third-party programs is very mealy-mouthed. And which is kind of insulting. I didn't mean it as an insult, but it's just not like direct in terms of PSB's obligation to students and their caregivers and the programs themselves. So
And in our conversation with Lisa, she seemed to indicate, Mariah, correct me if I'm wrong, that any of those programs were in fact covered.
correct. And the part where like you actually say private providers may not have to provide services if the activity is not sponsored by the school or if it's on campus. But the point is, the sentence before that, PSB is required to, if it's provided on campus in the school, PSB is required to provide those supports. And so I think that like that's the important thing that has been missing from our policy and practice. And I think it's not very clear here. And I guess I don't, so that's the thing that next to last sentence in the paragraph that Betsy has the cursor on now, that if an activity is provided on campus, that's the part that I think is sort of the critical part to be clear on PSB's responsibility.
And I think that goes to like the PTO run programs on campus too, right? So
Or,
that's
right, any extracurriculars, but yeah,
Right.
the extracurriculars. And I guess I don't really like the heading of this bothers me, the limits on student rights. I don't know, it just seems like the reverse of the framing that I'd like to see, which is really, this is about the supports that are provided as opposed to the limits on student rights. And I think you had a section on other thing, I can't, it was above this, there was like, it was divided up on the like these activities, right? So I guess these are the school sponsored ones that you were dividing up. But some of these things aren't necessarily school sponsored. Like, I don't know, it gets a little confusing sometimes, like, I guess clubs for cooking, for example, like if it's PTO run, I don't know, just some of the wording. I feel like we divided things in a way that for a child in the life of the school, it doesn't matter to them whether it's run by the extended day or the PTO or a teacher in the classroom. And often maybe parents don't even know. And so the question
or a
is,
third-party athletic provider that's
right,
that's in a building.
yeah, exactly. Like who runs the program to me is immaterial, as opposed to the fact that it's run in the building for students who are students in that school. And so what are our obligations under that scenario, as opposed to parsing the service provider?
Which I
Well,
think then means that we would need to, David, amend that paragraph subsequent to the one we were just looking at. I think it starts
Well,
recognizing.
we could do that, but this is why I find this conversation important, because the way I worded this so far was to go with certain legal realities, but we're able to go past that if we want to. We can always exceed the minimum. So,
But I don't think you're exceeding the minimum, David. I think that legally this does not actually comply with what the law is. We're currently not complying, and this also doesn't comply.
third-party providers are not, depending on where the program is, are not required to follow
But
it.
we
That's clear.
are required.
If we want them to, we can.
No, but we are
Ask them to.
required. We are required. If it's part of the life of the school, that it's part of the life of the school. Independent of their obligation, we have the obligation.
All right, we
Can
can
you give
word
an
that. as well.
example?
Yeah, I
Sure.
can give you an
Oh,
example.
go for it, Connie.
Yeah, so a PTO runs, I don't know, a chess club after, they do it once a week for 8 weeks or something. But a student needs their one-to-one in order to attend to that and fully participate. The third-party vendor, the PTO in that case, wouldn't necessarily be responsible, but PSB would be responsible for finding the support for that student to fully participate in that activity. That's one example.
And sorry, and David, what are you saying that what are we required to do in that example?
In that example, if it's at a school property, we would have to provide the support. So that part's clear, but if it's a third-party provider and it's something that's not occurring on school grounds, then we would not have to do so. That doesn't mean that by policy, we couldn't say that we will, but we would not be required to. And
So
then
the
also
words
the
that
other-
you
the
just
other
said,
trick-
David, sound different than the words I read on the page. So that's helpful.
Because I don't want to create false impressions. So when we provide a support from a legal perspective, it's a minimal support, a minimum support to allow that access. It's not necessarily a support to provide a high level qualitative experience. And so that's why I just get a little nervous about wording it too strongly and over promising if it's not something that the district has the financial resources to do, or if it's going to end up being just that minimum.
But I think that the standard is meaningful, right? Isn't it meaningful participation? It's not minimal participation. I think it's meaningful participation.
I can try to find, there was some Supreme Court language that it sounded more like minimal, but I can try to pull up the exact words.
That was IDEA or was it Massachusetts law?
US Supreme Court.
I'm not sure if people can see my hand up. I guess I had a related question, which is like in a hypothetical like the one Val just described, who would determine sort of the level of support that's needed for the child to participate? It's not as clear cut as an IEP that spells it out for a regular school activity.
Well, I guess the question is, what are the accommodations needed for that program, right? So if your IEP requires you to have, for example, structured organizational stuff to be able to access the academics, that's a different support than's needed for chess club or whatever. And I think you're right, there needs to be some sort of wording around how the district and the provider, whoever the provider is, and the parents and caregivers sort of connect to ensure that the support being provided, that's one issue, the big issue, how that support being provided is appropriate, because it might not be scoped in the IEP or discussed in the IEP because it sort of goes beyond that, right?
And for an IEP, I mean, getting all those parties to agree on the type and level of support that's needed can often be a long, difficult process. So you can't assume that people will agree on what's needed for a particular after-school activity.
I think when we discussed it, it was going to be like Linus or designee, thinking that it would be Lisa as an arbiter for these things.
Well, but the other thing that I think is important to think about is the issue, and I think, David, you're alluding to this too, is the issue of actually being able to staff something. And so I think that being realistic to our obligations is, or I'll say being committed to our obligations is one thing, and then being realistic to being able to have a staff member or whoever it is commit to, if it's a cooking, just going back to the chess club, that's an hour once a week for 8 weeks. How do we comply with that? I think that that's like a different issue and almost also as complex. And it doesn't actually negate the fact that we're obligated to comply with it, but just the actual realities of hiring and staffing. How do we make sure that that works?
I also want to make sure that in our language, we're very clear that out of district students are eligible for all life of the school programs, right? Like all after school activities, extracurricular activities.
Can I ask a question about, and this is a little bit of my ignorance, and I know that I see some representatives of CPAC here. For children who are not at the high school, who are at elementary school aged, do they have a like quote unquote homeschool, like in district school assigned to them? Like, for example, if you are placed out of district, can you attend extracurriculars at any school, or do you attend the extracurriculars of a certain school? Because that too, I think, like, if there should be that connection made to ensure that those students are fully participating, then having that identified to begin to be, to like, for example, get on the list to be able to see what the extracurriculars that are being offered are. Does anyone know?
No, but
I'm not totally sure, Maria. It's a good question. We can
Some of
ask
our-
Lisa.
some of our CPAC folks, I know that you had been interested in testifying. Do you want to jump in for a couple minutes? Just raise your hand and we can move you over if you want to speak for a couple minutes. Faith, Linda, Margot.
Faith just messaged me and said it's usually the local school. So I presume you mean the
Faith has her
district.
hand raised also.
Oh,
Okay, can we just move Faith over for a couple of minutes?
Yep, doing that right now. Here she comes.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
It's usually the local school, the school that you're either the school that you were most recently domiciled to or your local school.
Faith, is there anything else you want to add on this policy so far?
So my biggest concerns are maybe is not an effective way of getting the supports that our students need, where I can't see the whole thing, so it's really hard for me, but somewhere in there it says maybe, and that's not very good. And then a lot of the sports that we're talking about take place outside of the school sometimes, and also the maybe is not particularly clear. But a lot of the sports take place outside of the school as well. So students do need supports outside of school. And sometimes minimal support is having a paraprofessional working with that student. And that is actually what they're entitled to by law.
And so are you talking about away games and things like that, Faith?
I'm
Or
talking about away games. I'm talking about when unified sports happens at different locations. I'm talking about things that are part of the life of the school that like prom. Prom doesn't happen at the school, but all students should be entitled to attend.
Right, but those are examples where it's very clearly directly sponsored by the school. So yes, we can make the language more clear, but the gray area is when it's a third-party provider and it's not at the school. And then even there, in terms of the support that could be provided, trying to find the exact language, but
So when is it a third party that's not at the school that this would be applicable?
I could give one example, which is imagine Brookline Rec after school programming. That is not like, right, that's not at the school, or people who go to trust for, I'm just thinking of one example. There's a couple of extended day programs that are not directly linked to any one school.
right.
So the extended day, so my understanding of the law is that the extended day programs that are not linked to a school are not part of the life of the school. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, so Brookline Rec if, like, I don't think that the school is required to offer paras for Brookline Rec services. I think that this services that should be required are the programs that are in the schools themselves. I think that Brookline Rec, they have people, they have therapeutic mentors that can work with students through Brookline Rec. Brookline Rec. They have people. That's what Micah's there for, and he's amazing.
But
And
that's
he
not
has
like a
that-
para who's, if a kid needed an aid, right?
But if somebody needs an aid, then that's something that you would take up with the therapeutic person. The only other exception would be PTO sponsored events. They should be considered life of the school. But Brookline Rec has people that work with students with disabilities, and they should be providing those people. I don't think that's within the scope of the school committee or Public Schools of Brookline. Am I wrong?
Well,
I guess the
that's
question, go ahead, sorry, David.
one of my goals for this policy,
Right.
and I think others have this goal as well, is to be broader than just what strictly is required of the schools and being strict about whether it's school sponsored or not. Because we do have extended day programs that are not officially a part of the schools, but we want our students to be able to participate in those activities in an equitable manner with accessibility. And so the question is, are there ways that even if we don't have direct control over it, we can encourage movement in that direction? So that's what I was attempting to do with the latter two paragraphs in this, essentially saying that anyone we're going to contract with, even if they're a third-party provider, they're going to have to provide a written plan about how they will at least abide by the spirit of the IDEA Act. And that information needs to be public so that there's transparency for parents and caregivers about these third-party programs. And if they're not going to cooperate, and if they're not going to make that commitment, we're not going to work with them, because that's a value of our school district. So I would like this to be a little more comprehensive than just covering the bare minimum of what we're obligated to do for our own programs.
Can I ask, David, I like that the value that you're trying to promote through this policy, is it in response to reports that third-party providers have not sufficiently been inclusive in their programming? Yes.
It is, and I think Margot is on the attendees. If you wanted to talk about that a little more directly.
I'll promote Margot now, see if she.
Right. Mariah and I have both had our own personal experiences.
But also, I think I'll say it's not just about providers who aren't being inclusive, but for particularly the extended days. This came up in our conversation, Stephen, about the fees, is that some of them are trying to accept kids, but there's very uneven application of PSB's responsibility. And so some of them are paying for one-on-ones out of their own budget, and some of them are having one-on-ones provided by PSB. And it makes it difficult for them to be able to accept these kids because they might not have the budget to be able to pay a one-on-one. And it makes it difficult for them to even know whether they're going to get coverage. And so just having it be very clear what the obligation of the district is, so that
makes
the
a lot of
program,
sense to
exactly,
me.
so that the programs can plan for this.
Right.
And,
So I
and
like, that's
commit,
great.
yeah, commit to kids.
And
within
some of them are not
guidelines.
accepting kids at all and just saying, no, you know, doesn't work.
If this has the effect of requiring all extended days to cover, to even raise fees so that they can all cover additional personnel for students with disabilities, and then that causes PSB to reckon with the fact that that extended day may not be sufficiently accessible, and we have an obligation to.
No, it's the exact opposite, though.
The obligation is ours.
Yes, it's not their obligation, it's our obligation. So
That's what I'm trying to say.
yeah,
I'm trying to say if this I'm working through this in my head. I'm sorry that I'm being so slow. If this causes their fees to rise, and that should make us reckon with the fact that it's our obligation to subsidize these programs, so to make them fully and equitably accessible.
I don't
So
think
there
Mariah's
aren't-
envisioning that we have to go through that intermediate stage where the extended days have to raise their fees. It's simply that we step in and assume our obligations.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Right, but it's something that can be disguised if some have assumed that obligation and some have not.
Right, but
I'm
the goal would
just
be
saying-
starting in the fall that they would not be, right? That this would be a very clear policy that PSB
Right.
would be providing that. The same for PTO sponsored events, the same for sort of standard PSB sponsored events. That all of those are dealt with in the same way and that it's PSB's clear obligation under both law and policy.
I
have to say
agree.
say one more thing, sorry. Acceptance also has to be equitable. It's very important that acceptance into the programs is also equitable because there's a very strange way that many of these programs accept students. And if they're doing this in an inclusive way, then all acceptance should be equitable.
Margot came on and then I started talking about this while she was getting transferred over. I'm sorry, Margot.
I'm here. Yeah, I sort of got lost in that discussion, but that's okay. Yeah, I brought up a concern that specifically about what we're at Lawrence, the after the LSA, like the after school classes, I just every like season that they've been offered, I kind of thought about doing it, but they have a statement on their page that's like, make sure you make a good choice for your kid. Like, you know your kid best, and basically like don't sign them up for something they can't handle. And I just was like so turned off that I didn't try to sign up for anything. But my hope is that in the future, and I've been working with our IEP team on this, but my hope is that like maybe his para that he works with all day could just stay for an hour after school to do a class once a week or something like that. I know I heard Mariah talking about hiring and staffing, but if there's a possibility, I don't know how the paras, if they do like timesheets or something, but if they could just stay for an extra hour, that seems very doable to me. But yeah, so my concern was with the special activities, or I know I think every school has a similar thing, but with different names, but the enrichment classes.
The wording that Margot is talking about, I just found the pages. If your child does not listen well and likes to run away or hide, please think carefully before registering them for a class that goes outside. And then, and I think the wording was a little stronger before. It looks like it's been modified. But one of the things says, please be aware that if your child receives additional support from aides in the Lawrence classroom, they are not present during LSA classes, as LSA is an independent nonprofit.
Yeah, I mean, so I think part of what we're going to have to convey to OSS in operationalizing this is education of some of these programs annually, or however we do that.
Well, I liked what David said too about, it's such about education, but like when programs are booking space, there's a contract, like they sign up with facilities and like the facilities team to actually book space. So that's an opportunity to review their rights with PSB, for example, the student rights defined under this policy and their obligations to make sure that PSB knows what's going on, so that those are
Non-discriminatory acceptance policies, all of that stuff. Yeah.
And to the extent that we can have a list that we add in here about sort of what our requirements will be to partner with third-party providers. If they're going to use our space and be our partner, they have to agree to certain conditions beyond just financial terms.
Can I add one more thing, guys?
Sure, go ahead.
The same goes for camps that are done during the school year. This has been a huge, not during the school year, during the summer. They're still done in Brookline Public School buildings, and they should be included as well. This has been an ongoing issue because of transitions between programs, partial day programs, and it's something that should be addressed.
So how do you view that differently, Faith, than what you said earlier about Brookline Rec programs?
So these are programs that are taking place right in the public schools of Brookline alongside extended school year. So that's the difference I see. So if they're
ESY or the Project Gator or whatever, right? Like the different
programs. that
Yes,
are-
the different literacy programs and whatever. And we actually, Val, you and I talked about that with Lisa. And we had
did,
talked about
we did.
those being
Yeah.
part of this. And Lisa mentioned that this year, for the first time, buses are being provided from ESY to rec sites, which is a huge improvement over prior practice.
Is
So
it actually happening? I knew it was mentioned, but Janae, can you confirm that's happening? Yes,
It's happening. Yeah,
for all ESY programs?
I believe so. I think, I believe so. Yes. I was just talking to some ESY folks this morning. I believe that's right.
Okay.
But I think that, as you're saying, Faith, that even if it's summer programming, which is sponsored by PSB, then, which is what we talked about with Lisa, and she agreed that
Yeah.
also fell within the scope of what we're talking about. Because it does a family no good to be told you get support during ESY, and then your kid has to go to camp in the afternoon and doesn't get the support because it makes ESY inaccessible, so. I'm feeling really positive about this, even if the wording isn't exactly what we wanted. I'm like, we are going in the right direction, so,
We're definitely going in the right direction.
yeah.
Janae, do you have
Anything-
any comments on this version? I know you probably didn't see it until.
I actually haven't seen it. And so I'm trying to read what, as Faith mentioned, I'm trying to read what's on the screen. So I haven't seen the whole thing, but I completely agree. I'm loving the conversation and where this is going. But when I get the whole document, I'll be able to say a little bit better.
Betsy, can we email it to Janae?
Absolutely, yep.
Thank you.
You want it to go to the CPAC info email address too? Would that be useful for, so they can see it sooner too?
Okay.
David, I also liked this paragraph. I don't know if you wrote that or where that came from, but the part about, and this is sort of what Faith was alluding to too, about the process for acceptance has to be also considered too. And so thinking about the accommodations for within even the tryout process or the acceptance process was good.
Oh, the other thing that I was going to mention is students who are out of district have been denied access to programming in the afternoons. And I've had to step in and intervene and make sure that those students were not excluded. So it is something that needs support. Like you were saying, we do need to educate the programs involved, the PTOs. Everybody needs to understand the law, basically.
And I think we need to work on, right, on all aspects of that with out of district transportation. If somebody is coming to a high school event and needs transportation from their out of district to a high school event, then we need to make sure we're doing all, we need to make sure we're covering all of our obligations.
Sounds to me too, like we don't, given that we didn't even know the policy about which school they get assigned to, like it might just be a question too of setting up the systems so that there's.
Sorry,
Like-
Mara, I didn't hear your question earlier. What was that about the system that, who they're assigned?
My point is that we asked, I said, well, how do they know which extracurriculars, like what is their homeschool, like, is it?
Out
you
of
know,
district kids, you mean?
Right, out of
They
district
don't,
kids.
they don't. We have a terrible. we still have a
Exactly. That's
Terrible email policy. I
exactly.
don't know.
So
I don't get emails for any, the only reason I know anything is because I have another child there, right? Who's exactly the
Exactly.
same age.
So even like, it might be something like, the computer system needs to have a secondary field where you are tagged to a school so that you even get those like principal announcements or whatever, like rather than just having everything have to be manually overridden. Anyways, the point being that like to fully engage in the life of the school, but at least having the policy will start to be another push in the of clarity in the right direction.
Yeah,
I agree. I was just gonna say too, back to Faith's point about the education piece, so long as this policy lends toward the entire community being educated about this, so other parents know this, students know this, educators know this, the principal, it's just common knowledge, so that isn't these big question marks and kids feeling stigmatized or whatever the case may be, once this goes forward. So this is very exciting.
I think I have a suggestion. Can you not scroll down for just a
Oh, sure,
moment?
yeah.
Scroll back up.
Mhm.
For strengthening the language just a bit. I know we're not going to wordsmith it, but rather than merely have to disclose how they're going to voluntarily comply, what if they had to describe how they would comply, and that language had to be approved for future contracts? So they didn't merely have to state their willingness to voluntarily comply, but they had to provide sufficiently strong language that had to be approved.
So I have a problem with this whole paragraph, because at the end of the day, the obligation is ours, not
Right.
theirs. And so, like, I think that there's components of, like we talked about, their acceptance processes and whatever, but the wording of this to me right now implies that they have to, for example, they have to come up with a staffing plan. No, they don't. The staffing plan responsibility is ours. So what this looks like, I almost think like it's about, they have to come up with a plan, or they have to agree to. It's almost like I don't want them to come up with a plan because they don't know. We have maybe like a checkbox, like I agree to notify PSB when I've been notified, or I agree to share my student list with PSB so we can collaborate on IEP, knowing who has IEPs and how we support that, or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, this is a PSB policy about our practices. So
To me, Mariah, this goes to what you were talking about earlier, right, on when they're signing for space, that
yeah,
it's like
exactly.
it's like a checklist, a reminder that of course you comply with ADA, IDA. Here's the checkbox that you are working with staff to make sure you know who's on IEPs, et cetera, and then tick down what that checkbox system is when they are renting the space,
Yeah.
getting the space donated to them, or however they're getting the space.
Could we have an
Margo?
example maybe of that checklist provided? Because perhaps that's something that should be built into this policy. So it's very clear what exactly it is that these third-party providers are committing themselves to. I think that would provide some comfort for those in the community to know that.
And off the top of my head, I think it's a non-discriminatory acceptance procedure. It's certainly ADA, IDA, all applicable law. It's coordination with PSB on which students who are participating are on an IEP.
Or maybe we say need accommodations. I guess I'm not sure we
Yeah,
want to
just
share
50
that, like,
Also,
yeah,
right, it might be a 504 or any other thing.
Yeah.
Accommodations.
Margot has her hand raised. I don't know if you can see.
Sorry,
that.
Margot.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to make a point real quick because I did reach out to the LSA directors, and they mentioned, so I guess like LSA is under the PTO, but then they hire staff from, like, I want to say they might have even used the term third party, but like they might contract with like Net Results Tennis or something. So that's like, I don't know if that's like a fourth party or something, but just a suggestion that you might want to make it clear, like who exactly has to like do the checklist, or how they're going to manage, like how is the PTO going to make sure that their own contractors follow this.
And any subcontractors, we could just add in any relevant subcontractors to the checklist.
Yeah. I also think I don't want to write the checklist into the policy, because I want the checklist to be operationalized as opposed to policy. I think it could say things like it could be e.g. or such as, but not limited to, but I don't want to be explicit on exactly what the things are, because there might be a better idea that comes along, or we want to tweak the wording. I want to be more flexible.
All right, any other thoughts?
I think a subject to but not limited, subject but not limited to is a good way to at least get the ones that are on our minds now that can always be amended.
Okay,
Andy?
Yeah, I just want to get clear. Is there any aspect where we're clearly going beyond what the law requires, or are we basically just kind of spelling out what it means for PSB to comply with the law?
From my read of the law, we're just spelling out our requirements under the law.
Okay.
I think it's slightly gray, but we are interpreting it in the spirit as opposed to the letter is the way I would say.
right. So
Okay.
for example, in Minnesota, granted, Minnesota's not Massachusetts, but in Minnesota, there have been arguments between school districts and the courts about what level of accommodation is required to be provided. And the courts have interpreted more broadly, in Minnesota at least, as to what is required than school districts have. And so there's sort of that constant tension between what support actually means and what it entails. And my hope is that this policy is going to provide sufficient enough support to truly be meaningful, rather than perhaps the minimal requirements as interpreted by courts potentially. I think if we're clear about that, so there's no gray area, so that parents and caregivers with certainty can know that their child is going to be afforded certain supports if enrolling in activities will be helpful. And also, I think that it'll make it easier to navigate through whether it's school sponsored, whether it's not school sponsored, because as Mariah was saying earlier, at the end, none of that should really matter from the parent's perspective. If it's at the school, if it's something they're signing their child up for, they want to know that there will be supports in place, period. And so to the extent that our policy can make that clear, that that's how it's going to happen, and that it's not going to be a laundry list of if A, then B, and if C, then D, but not if E, we can helpfully streamline.
I wonder if it's worth making the point in like a preamble or something that like this policy is, it embodies how we think, what we think PSB needs to do in order to comply with the law, right? It's our interpretation of the law as it applies to us, which may not be how Newton say would interpret it, but this is how we do it.
Okay.
Well, to us and to the district, we want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I agree
But
with you.
I think the
I
point
agree
is
with you.
more
We
to
don't
make it
think
clear that
we're.
we don't see ourselves as going beyond the law here, or
Right.
doing add-ons that are optional, that this is what we think the law actually means.
I'm sorry, it says reasonable accommodations. Who defines reasonable accommodations if it only says reasonable accommodations here?
I think with the wording here, all needs to get adjusted to be based on the conversation.
So
David, do
reasonable
you agree?
I do, although the reasonable accommodation language is statutory and the courts often use it. And the reason that they use that term is because accommodation is supposed to be provided to a level, of course, that's sufficient to allow participation, but not if it's going to be to the degree that the underlying program itself has to change. So for instance, there's an example that's provided in the context of running track and a student that's hard of hearing, and that a reasonable accommodation there would be waving a flag instead of listening to blowing the whistle. But if the accommodation were such that now the other kids couldn't participate in running and there would be no track at all, then you don't have to provide an accommodation that goes to that degree. So that's why it's reasonable rather
So
than
the
absolute.
problem with reasonable is a team could use that to say that a para support is not a reasonable accommodation.
That's true. That is how the law is written now, though, for that reason, because an accommodation that rises to the level of depriving the others is not considered reasonable.
But having a para is not depriving anybody.
No, I agree with you. I'm not arguing with it. I'm just telling
Okay.
you the reason why the reasonable accommodation term exists.
I
It's-
totally
David-
understand. but I think it needs to be more specific.
Could we have a
Otherwise-
definition though of reasonable accommodations that makes clear that it does not allow for the exclusion such as what Faith is describing?
Yes.
I mean, are we getting back here to my earlier question about who decides on the level of support that's needed or the type of support? And I think Val said that at least in preliminary discussions, the idea was that the superintendent or designee would do that, would make that determination. Is that really how we want it to be done?
I think that that's going to be bogged down because that's not how IEPs are decided, right?
Right.
Right,
But
but
IEPs
then
again are
you're
decided
getting
through
a team
a
meeting.
complicated process that often, you know, takes a while to reach consensus or conclusion. Right?
But if someone's on an IEP, like the parent can just call a team meeting to discuss it. I mean, if if a kid is not on an IEP, you're right, that would be a long process. But if they're already on an IEP, the only delay is like the central office, probably. I mean, I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, but you call a team meeting and then the reality is it takes 2 to 3 weeks. And then
Right.
if you don't agree at the first hour, then you have to come back again in 2 to 3 weeks. And if a class is 8 weeks long, then the class, it's already ended by the time you've had
I
this
thought
agreement.
that's why we were having one, person as a point person rather than a 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 person team.
Well, why can't it just be derived directly from the IEP? I guess like your accommodations are your accommodations, whether they're physical,
Accommodation
behavioral, academic.
What is the downside of that?
Well, I think
the issue is the grid, right? Like the services are
Yes,
defined in the grid based on the school day.
On the activity itself may be very different from, from whatever is going on, from the academic activity that, that the support is being provided for in the IEP.
But the point is that if you have a behavioral accommodation or a physical accommodation, those should or whatever, an academic accommodation, any of those things could theoretically be translated to the activity.
I guess, Mariah, I can see an example of a student who has an executive function issue in their IEP that during the school day is addressed with a BCBA consult and school, the gen ed teacher. But for, I don't know, some pottery class, they're going to need someone who's actually sitting with them because their gen ed teacher and the BCBA aren't available in that circumstance, right? Because it's less structured. So I can see some activities where it's like a general issue. An executive function just comes to mind now, or ADHD or something, right? And that's managed, I think, in different ways in an academic setting when there's a team.
Well, maybe this is the question that we bring back to David, that you bring back to staff and say, how would this is the part where we need their feedback on how they would frame that. Do they want it to go all through the deputy superintendent, or will that bog them down?
Okay.
Or what's their proposal for how that would work efficiently? My concern is inefficiency and it just dragging on.
So
Is
it
it
feels to
building
me,
leader? Is it who is it? Yeah.
but it feels to me like it should be a team decision, and it should be part of the IEP process itself. Like if your child is if your child is interested in this, then we will provide the para support, or then we will provide the breakdown of tasks.
I just don't know how you work that out, Faith, a year in advance, right? A year in advance, some course gets the PTO, however many times a year it does, 2 or 3 sessions a year, hosts 12 different classes, and there are 12 different ones each time that they're offered. I don't know how you would sort out what your child might be interested in doing 6 months down the line.
So it could be a more generic thing in the IEP than instead of getting approval for each individual child or each individual student, you have it written in the IEP saying that when or if this child needs support for this activity, for any activities that are extracurricular, then we will do X. Do you know what I mean?
I agree with Val. I'm not sure you could, like, if the kid decides they want to do chess club versus karate versus, I don't know, outdoor adventures, right? Like those have such different expectations of behavior and, right, like ability to escape.
In terms of the
But-
importance of having an IEP team come together to reach a decision, but also the efficiency concern, we could have both. So there could be that there's an interim plan that's put into place, which is made at the discretion of a certain individual who is designated in the policy. And simultaneous to that, if the parent or caregiver requests an IEP meeting, that IEP meeting be held, and then whatever the interim plan is could be amended as necessary.
I also want to get back to what we sort of started with, which are that some kids may have 504s, some may not have IEPs yet. So that was how we were talking about accommodations rather than by identifying them as having an IEP. So I think that we need to have, if we're going to do it as part of an IEP meeting, we also have to have a different mechanism for kids who don't have IEPs. Or just for changing circumstances for kids with IEPs.
Right?
So is that a new hand? Mariah?
What I wanted to say actually is taking this completely out of just the special education realm is we've talked about, for example, METCO students and being able to participate in after school activities and the disappearance of the late bus and how we ensure, I believe that the late bus is still not happening. And so how we make room for kids to be able to participate in after school activities, whether it's after school tutoring, extracurriculars, whatever the range of activities are that happen after school that kids might want to be in. And this policy doesn't talk about that right now.
I agree. It's a very important addition to make.
Janae, do you know if late bus? I heard this a couple weeks ago. It still isn't happening. Do you know?
I thought that it was. I was just texting Malcolm to double
Okay.
check. Give me a sec. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, in the meantime, any other thoughts? Again, this is a very initial draft that was put together quite quickly, more for discussion purposes. But
I have
think we
one
have
more.
Go ahead, Mariah.
Sorry, just that one of the things that I think more broadly we should be thinking about is, for example, how do we provide after school services for kids who are attending extended days? So for example, there may be multiple kids who have dyslexia, who need additional, who can't just do homework in extended day and they need additional support as one example. And so how do we start to think about kids, not just with their individual accommodations, but building in systems of support where multiple kids could benefit? I don't know how that gets in here or what it looks like, but I think often our conversation focuses on sort of, for example, the aids for extended day, but some of this is about actually much more technical, I guess. I don't know what the right word is, but specific support like that also should be considered as we're thinking about how to make sure that kids are being successful in their full day at school. So whether it is that we do specific programming like from 2:30 to 3:30 that allows them to do homework during that time with people who can support them. But I'd like us to think about that specifically, the academic supports that go beyond, that go speak to what is in their IEP or their 504, but that are require specific professional capabilities.
All right, anyone else? Okay, then why don't we move on now to discussion and possible vote on non-discrimination on gender identity policy. And Betsy, if you could pull that up.
Will do.
Thank you. So this one essentially is a cut and paste from a DESI advisory. And I changed some of the verbiage around so that it's applying to PSB and shortened certain sections that seemed maybe a little bit repetitive.
What did you shorten, David?
Janae, did you get this one too? Or you did not get this?
So some of the statutory explanations, I truncated those, just referencing the law and maybe having 1 or 2 sentences summarizing it instead of 3 paragraphs.
David, if you have a minute, I can answer while people are looking at this, I can answer the late bus for MECO question.
Sure, go right ahead.
And Malcolm's saying it does in fact run Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but there isn't a monitor, so it's for kids 4th grade and up. It also goes to all elementary schools starting at Baker, which means the pickup times vary a lot. He's in seed and we'll say more later, but yes, that's what we thought. It is running.
But does it matter that it's not running every day?
I think he's got more to say. I knew that it was
Oh.
running on Fridays. I'm not sure why not Tuesdays, but definitely Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday. I'll get more when he gets done.
Do we have a definition of young student, number 2?
I don't think so, so probably should add
There's a
that.
whole section on when a student doesn't need to speak with their parents, right? Or
Yes,
yeah,
I think that's coming later, so I believe that's age 14 is the cutoff there. Yes, here it is. Last paragraph above the gender markers heading.
but that's only on actual records. I think in our policy for like social things like name,
Yes,
the best practice is to allow a student to go by their preferred name, even if their parents are less okay with it. And just not change Aspen, right? And not change formal communications home, but the sort of best practice from a like global public health standpoint for that student is to support, again, social things, name, things like that. And essentially carry like 2 files, internal files.
Could you repeat that, Val?
That you don't change their official record, you just make a note that the student would like to be called Sam, right? And not Samantha going forward.
That's correct.
Okay. A question on footnote 9. Oh, I'm sorry. I see. So that's just on student records. So at what age do may students not need their parents do schools not need to consult with parents or caregivers on these matters,
On which matters?
on matters of students' self-identity, names and pronouns?
Names and pronouns, they don't need to agree on ever.
Okay.
Janae, do you have a different take on that?
No, I don't think so. I don't think they ever do. I think depending on ages and stuff, certainly there may be some encouragement around a conversation or
Right,
I'm not,
right.
yeah, but
Yeah.
So Val, in the names and pronouns section of this policy, it does address using a student's chosen name, but it goes a step further saying that the school shall accurately record that student's chosen name in all records. So are you saying that there should be an intermediate step where it doesn't quite have to go to that extent?
I think when they're under 14, if their parents are not consenting, is that stage where you can keep just like a manila folder of preferred name, Sam, preferred pronouns, they, them. And then when they're 14, they can do it themselves. This is only in a case where you've encouraged them to have a conversation with their family members. They don't want to have that conversation. They're 12 years old. So they're not 14 yet to be able to change their markers themselves. So they're at that like in between. Again, like guidance and their safe adults have encouraged conversation, or they know that there's a safety issue and so they're not pushing that conversation, whatever the school team is working through with that student, but they're not 14 yet, then that's when I would suggest that, again, just so that teacher X knows and the nurse knows how to identify that student without making that change in Aspen.
Okay. Right.
This may be obvious, but it's not obvious to me. Well, a couple of things I'm going to start with. One is, can we remove the gendered language from here? Like the paragraph that's right there that says his or her student record. Like it seems particularly appropriate to have all of that removed in this policy above all. And then my second question is, and I'm just not sure if the language here, are all students required to be marked male or female? Because the wording of the student record makes it sound like, or at least I interpret it as you had to, if you could be one or the other, and you don't have to be the one assigned at birth, but that like, does it allow for options? Because the way it was written, I think it's above. If you go up a little bit, right here. Yep, where it says for transgender students should reflect male, or it says, for example, male or female on a permanent record. But is there anything where we are making it clear that people don't have to have one or the other?
Janae, do you know if we have a non-binary choice?
I believe we do. Let me double check. For whatever reason, I'm remembering a lot of students going by they, them, but I feel like the designation may have been male or female. Let me double check. I'll tell you in a minute.
I think this is part of what Safe Schools is working on with DESE now to really update this to be more inclusive of non-binary students.
Thanks. And then my last question is, and let me, so I'm confused about, for students, I guess if you could make it clear, for students who are not communicating with their family because they don't feel safe or their family does not agree or whatever's going on, can you just make clear again, like the ages and stages, like younger than, I think it's younger than 14 and then 14, I'm assuming 14 to 18. Like what is, I guess I'm confused, like if a student is not legally of age, so they're younger than 18, what the rights are of the different parties, because I'm finding that confusing still.
So the rights of the student are to names and pronouns that comport with their internal identity and dignity. I mean, there's no recorded age, but if we're talking like true elementary, then generally with support of the family or with lots of conversation with that student about discussion with a family, with guidance, again, with trusted adults. I think when you get to that like middle school age, you're fairly differential to that 12, 13-year-old who is pretty clear and is pretty clearly able to identify why their parents are not involved or their caretakers are not involved in, caregivers are not involved in that decision. I don't know that we want to like delineate that below 14. I think we want to probably leave it to the school team's discretion.
But I guess I would find it helpful to be able to understand what school teams think is the right thing, and maybe it's by age ranges or whatever, but I guess like being able to understand, from my perspective, being able to understand it so that I can strongly advocate it for it would be helpful. And I just don't quite understand it still. And it sounds like from what you're saying, it's very situationally dependent, if I'm right. But like there are wordings in here of a student who is like, there's some stuff here which is very specific about ages and grades. And I am having a hard time differentiating why some things are specific and some things aren't.
I have to say that's where my mind is also. I'm thinking, what about cases where a student is in an unsupportive home environment? And are there ages where teachers have an obligation not to disclose a student's chosen name and pronoun in a school environment? For instance, during a parent-teacher conference, can a student say, I don't want you to disclose that at school I have a certain gender identity and a certain chosen name and pronoun? What's the teacher's obligation in that circumstance? And is it different for young youth and older youth?
And I would add on to that, what's our expectation of the teacher? Because there may be teachers who we would expect, well, they would preserve the student's choice, but they may perhaps not. And so how do we make everyone clear on what the expectations are?
And I would think that would differ depending on whether it's young youth or older youth.
Right. I can add in, at least in terms of for a permanent record, in terms of Aspen, we do have male, female, or non-binary. So that is an option for your gender marker.
I was looking more at the names and pronouns sections.
And the names and pronouns, they, them, at least at the high school level, I'm trying to find what I'm saying. I think it's consistent pre-K through 12, actually, so.
Val, do you
And
know
just to go back, like the last sentence of the paragraph, of the first paragraph under gender markers, it says like young students not able to advocate for themselves. But like, what does young mean? Like, I guess I'm just sort of feeling like a little bit like, what does that mean when sometimes people are too young to advocate for themselves, but other times they're not? And how are we really clear about making students even also know the kinds of support that they can expect and that we uphold system-wide? Because that's part of what makes things safe too, right? To know like those expectations around, if you do decide to disclose something, what is the reaction and how to be sure that it's safe.
And I think that goes back to Val's earlier point about the need to define young students, and there'll likely be a number or grade level or both that would be assigned as part of that definition. So yes, in order to utilize this policy from an advocacy perspective for parents or caregivers, I agree it's important to delineate at least somewhat by age and grade level what the different responsibilities are in terms of being able to try to effectuate change. Any other questions or thoughts?
David, do we have the section on other gender-based activities?
Yes.
Is there anything on specifically how this intersects with bullying?
A little bit under education and training.
Okay.
Under education and training, and I thought in the preamble, but maybe my recollection's wrong on that.
Natalia?
And I haven't looked at this in detail, but do we have sports in here? What is our policy on sports? And also, since we were talking about menstrual products, where do menstrual products kind of fit into this? Are there gender neutral bathrooms?
Sports are in here. Bathrooms come up in the context of locker rooms. But maybe not. Yes, restrooms. Restrooms are in here.
I think we also added something to the facilities policy like 2 years ago, if I
It
remember.
was like last year, I think.
Yeah, on
Yeah,
capital, we added something, right?
yeah,
Yes.
about all buildings having non-gendered bathrooms.
In every suite of something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it might be nice to cross-reference with this, with that and the menstrual products, if and when, or not if, but when that is adopted. But at least the other one is already adopted, the building policy.
Okay, so more.
Natalia's question about sports that's here in the physical education classes and interscholastic athletic activities section. And then also in the wellness policy that we referenced briefly earlier in the meeting, there is a lengthier section on the same topic.
Maybe we can link to the MIA policy here, David, which is pretty
Okay.
Substantial.
Can I ask another question relating to this? Does the student's identification as non-binary in the student record impact their ability to participate in sports? Because sports are gendered?
So the MIA policy actually addresses that and how a student can participate in a gendered sport, even if they identify as non-binary.
What does it say? Do you know? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I mean, I think it's like you can't switch every, 2 weeks for a track meet kind of thing. Like you have to sort of, my recollection is that you have to like pick and stick with it for some
The
period
season
of time
or something? Okay. Is there an opportunity to run the next draft of this policy if it hasn't already been run by students and staff who are participating in the GSAs and other?
Yeah, I think we should send it
programs?
to the task force, the LGBTQ task force too.
Yeah, task force had their last meeting on Friday, but I know they would love to see this. This is a great. Yeah, it
I missed the potluck.
was great.
Was it good? Yeah.
Mhm.
All right, so we'll
But I
have.
did see the students, Janae, at Pride on Saturday. It's great,
Awesome. I heard it was a great event.
fantastic.
So we'll certainly make some further revisions and have this sent out to GSAs and other stakeholder groups for input. Any final thoughts or questions on this policy? Natalia?
Just a quick, this policy is just for students or also for staff, faculty, and other like people who are engaged, like paras or other people who may need this policy?
So this one's specific to students, but if we wanted to broaden it to staff, we could certainly do that. Would others like to broaden it to include staff?
I think staff are covered by different state law. Non-discrimination just by Massachusetts Chapter 151B.
Can we
Uh,
reference that though?
The anti-discrimination law? Yeah.
Well, basically saying that like this policy covers students, however, we are fully committed to the same principles as applied to staff and other people who go into our buildings.
Yep.
Andy?
Did we ever come to a conclusion on sort of in the places where the current draft is vague and says the young students, how we would make that precise?
Well, I think what we're going to do is assign a specific age to it. So under the law, I think it's 14 is what differentiates young students from older students, but look, I'll double check on that.
Okay, because that would mean, among other things, that until somebody is 14, their parents can, for example, determine, their sports participation, right?
Right.
Because the MIAA relies on PSB, which in turn will rely on the student's own determination if they're above 14 or the parents if they're below 14.
Well, MIA is high school, so it doesn't really apply to the ages that we're talking about anyway.
Okay.
But either way, that's exactly the point, right? It's like who gets to decide and why and how and
Yeah, I mean, the students do certainly, and like we'll have to just come up with some better language.
And maybe it's not just above and below 14, right? I mean, maybe
No,
it's, I
it's
think,
not.
right, there's other gradations here of emotional responsibility and understanding. Can I ask another question though about this? This talks a lot about the title is non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity, and then the second sentence says the policy is intended to create a culture in which transgender and gender non-conforming students feel safe, supported, and fully included, which is very important and critical. And is it only for that, or is it also for students of any gender identity to feel safe and supported in different contexts? Do we reference Title IX and say that is the governing policy on equal access of women in educational programming and sports programming, or how do we?
I guess we could do that, yes. This is mainly focused on transgender and non-conforming, but male and female is obviously part of the gender spectrum as well, so we could incorporate that.
But do we not have that already crosswalk, David, like elsewhere?
We do have a section on Title IX and specifically for females. There isn't anything for males.
I guess I was thinking about, there was something in here about programs, and I was thinking, well, we have Girls Who Run is a school sponsored activity. And this is like, so are we saying that any student, regardless of gender identity, can participate in Girls Who Run? Maybe that's what is already the practice. I don't know. But how does this intersect with that? I mean, this policy is basically saying that there should be no discrimination on the basis of gender identity, but we have programs in our schools that are specifically about underrepresented identities and about affinity groups. So how do those two things intersect?
I do see your points, but would you suggest then changing the name of the policy? Because one could always argue that in supporting one group, potentially you're discriminating on another, and that can get a little ugly in certain contexts. And I'm not suggesting that's where you're going with this, but I'm wondering if perhaps just changing the title would be the way to address that issue.
I don't know. I mean, I see tremendous value in having safe spaces and affinity groups for people to be able to be their authentic selves and to get that support. And And I don't know what that means in the context of some of these programs. I just wish that we could talk about, can we have a paragraph that says that there's programs that do support, that we're still in support of programming that allows for identity specific support groups or something like that, or activities. Like, I don't want to do away with those activities just because we want people to have equal access to programming in general.
I'm not sure we would have to. So Janae, maybe you would have an answer to this. With affinity groups, if there's an Asian affinity group, for instance, can a white person be part of the Asian affinity group, or is it restricted to Asians only?
Absolutely. By law, of course, students are fully inclusive. So white students can absolutely attend an AAPI affinity group. Now, we've had moments where white students have come to join those and felt like, you know what, maybe this isn't where I want to be right now. And we've definitely had students within said affinity sort of feel, that what we've encouraged students to not say is you're not welcome. Certainly we would never say that. But absolutely, students and staff are allowed in any affinity space.
So in that case, Mariah, I think that the non-discrimination, there isn't discrimination, because in theory, someone could be part of a transgender affinity group and not be transgender. So we're not.
So for the program called Girls Who Run, do the teachers know that if boys apply, they are supposed to be, or I'll say people who aren't girls apply, who don't identify as girls apply, they are expected to have equal acceptance?
I don't know what every sort of group that's doing Girls Who Run or Girls That Run is doing. I know that there's been interest from students who are transgendered, who are interested in being in those groups. And from what I've heard, those students have been welcomed. I don't know that there was anything set in stone anywhere where people were having a conversation to say absolutely no, that this can't happen, which is a good reason why we're bringing this up, because potentially at some point there will be some challenges that go along with that. But
the reason I was thinking of that program specifically is because my understanding is it's typically way oversubscribed and not everyone can participate.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
Natalia?
Yeah, to Mariah's point, would it make sense for the policy, like, is this policy really intended to be just for transgender and gender nonconforming, or is it that this policy is intended to create a culture in which children of all genders, and especially transgender and gender, like, I haven't read it in detail, but was the intent to create a policy specifically for transgender and gender nonconforming students? And if that's the case, let's change the title, I think. Or is it to just bring gender dimensions into all of our policies?
So this is taken a lot from the DESE website, which is Safe Schools put this together, and that title is directly from there, but the focus of it is transgender and non-binary. It's not inclusive of all pieces of gender discrimination and other pieces of gendered activity.
So we could change the title, or we could make it inclusive of any gender identity. What would be the preference of the committee? Committees.
is there a larger policy around gender that this should be rolled into as part of a larger discussion on gender identity and affirmation? Or in which case I would say
there's Title IX, which comes up mainly in a different context than this, but other than Title IX, no.
And I personally would prefer that this is broadened slightly, but with emphasis, sort of as Natalia put it, to ensure that it's not just discussing binary gender roles, but the spectrum as described here.
Okay.
And I really think it's like a sentence or two at the beginning. That's my opinion, but.
All right. So with that, why don't we move on to our penultimate agenda item, which can be quick, which is an update from Stephen on sustainability, the panel network.
Oh, thanks, David. We have a good number of applications. Deadlines at the end of the week. Hopefully we will have enough to select up to 20 volunteers and have about 4 to 5 per group. There'll be 4 groups. That's
All
the
right,
update.
pretty good. Any questions for Stephen regarding the sustainability panel? All right, seeing none, any new business? Mariah?
Well, I'm not on policy and this isn't a DEIJ topic that I can see directly, but I'm hoping that there could be a policy around building access. Again, now that the COVID state of emergency has been lifted, the federal state of emergency, and thinking about how we sustainably and responsibly allow for people who are not staff to be able to be in the building to increase the sort of interactions with parents in the community and caregivers again. And I'm willing to draft something, but I have no idea what it would say yet, other than more or less what I just said.
Andy?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, like, would this involve drafting something from scratch, or does it glom onto some part of some existing policy? I mean, my understanding is that, you know, what the state of affairs during the pandemic got frozen in place sort of by fiat in a letter that Dr. Marini sort of sent out before the end of that school year, and that's just how it's been. But it never actually rose to the policy level, as far as I know. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
We did bring it up at the April workshop.
We talked about it, yeah.
Right, but it was just done by administrative fiat, and the school committee was not
In
involved.
fact, the exact opposite. It had been discussed and the school committee was against it before COVID, and there was a lot of back and forth. And then with COVID, obviously things changed, and then Dr. Marini, just as you said, administratively implemented it at the end of the 2019-2020 school year.
But in
Or
April,
2020-21.
wasn't Dr. Guillory going to speak to the building leaders and report back to us? I guess was my question from April. That was my
I
recollection.
think that was the last step of it, but yes, but I want to make sure that we don't lose it because it has to me, it's very important.
Yeah.
Janae?
I was going to say, it's not obviously at the level of policy, but in strategic planning, this has come up a lot. And there's been conversation about culture and community and ways to make this a thing come the rollout of the strategic plan. So there's been a lot.
A good thing or a bad thing?
A good thing.
Oh, good.
There's been a lot of there's been a lot of dialogue on both sides to show the not so good of it. But generally, it's sounding like that's exactly what the move would be. So
Well, that's great.
Natalia?
I was just going to ask if a policy is needed, you know, given COVID is no longer an emergency. Like we've switched so many things since May, you know, would it be appropriate for just administration to discuss it and say, you know, like we've made a lot of changes in May because of the lifting of the sort of federal COVID. So I don't know.
I think the reason there's a lot of interest in the policy is there had been, going 20 years back and even 10 years back, a practice where parents and caregivers could come into the school building. Schools were a more open environment. And so irrespective of what's happened with COVID, there's a lot of interest in knowing who can come into buildings, when, for how long, what can be the level of engagement. And so for those reasons, I think having a policy would be helpful. Stephen?
Yeah, I would strongly support someone drafting from scratch something opening up the school buildings. I think we've talked about this for at least a year. And I think if something is coming from administration, I would welcome it coming from that direction first. But if nothing is coming, then I would love for it to come from policy.
Janae?
I was going to say one piece that's come up a lot is, again, sort of access. And if you're talking about students who are bused in, so METCO students or families that can't just walk right in the beginning of the day or at the end of the day, just sort of a lot of thinking about what feels right in terms of welcoming families of color or Boston families into the buildings. So that's been something we've talked about a lot.
All right, so there'll certainly be more discussion on this, and it sounds like Mariah's volunteered to write a first draft, so that's great.
But it also sounds like I should hold off and see how it plays out in the first draft of the strategic plan and like.
Well, that's the fall. So
It is the fall.
Oh, okay. So maybe it sounds like the policy should come out to help inform the strategic plan.
I would back that.
Okay,
I agree.
okay,
I'm also happy to support drafting.
okay, thanks.
You have the
All right.
communications plan, Stephen, to do. That's a big one
I have a what?
from our last meeting. You signed up to do the communications policy, remember?
I don't. but I
When
believe-
incidents occur? Yeah.
In the minutes,
Right.
that we approved.
Yes.
All right, well, that's. Anyone else? Any other new business? All right, seeing none, that concludes our meeting for this evening. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to Faith and Linda, as well as Margot and others who came on and contributed to our discussion on inclusivity and life of the school. And there will certainly be more discussions on all these topics.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.